The fasting glucose number came back at 110. 5 years earlier, it was 85. You changed nothing. You ate the same food, maintained the same weight within 5 pounds, walked the same neighborhood. The physician said insulin resistance. You asked what changed. The answer you received was vague. Your body is not processing sugar as well. You left the office with a diagnosis you could name but not explain. Your cells pulled the insulin receptor off the surface. The resistance the number measured is an adaptation. Every cell adjusts its receptor count based on how frequently the signal arrives, and the signal that drives insulin receptor removal is insulin itself. Decades of frequent meals, snacking between them, glucose spikes driving insulin spikes, each spike pressing the receptor, trained the cell to reduce its sensitivity by removing the antenna that receives the signal. The resistance was the cell protecting itself from a signal that arrived too often. The spicy food discussion described TRPV1 receptors being pulled off the cell surface through clathrin-mediated endocytosis after repeated capsaicin exposure. Identical cellular machinery, different receptor, same physics. The cell that stopped responding to capsaicin and the cell that stopped responding to insulin both pulled their receptors off the surface for the same reason. What does insulin actually do at the cell surface, and how does removing the receptor prevent it? Insulin arrives at the cell membrane and binds to the insulin receptor, a protein that spans the membrane with its binding site facing outward and its signaling domain facing inward. When insulin binds the outer domain, the inner domain activates. The activation is mechanical. Insulin docking on the outer face of the receptor produces a conformational change that propagates through the membrane-spanning domain to the intracellular face, like pressing one end of a lever and watching the other end move, and the intracellular domain begins phosphorylating itself, adding phosphate groups to specific amino acid residues on its own structure. The self-phosphorylation is the signal. Each phosphate group added to the receptor's intracellular domain creates a docking site for the next protein in the signaling cascade. Signaling cascade runs through a sequence of proteins inside the cell, each one activating the next, amplifying the signal at each step. The final output of the cascade is a command to the cell's internal storage compartments: move the glucose channels to the surface. GLUT. 4. Glucose transporter type 4. These are the channels glucose uses to enter muscle cells and fat cells. Without GLUT4 in the membrane, glucose cannot cross. The channels are manufactured inside the cell and stored in vesicles, small membrane-enclosed compartments, sitting just beneath the cell surface, loaded with GLUT4 channels, waiting for the signal to deploy. When the insulin cascade reaches its endpoint, GLUT4 translocation through the insulin-activated ACT pathway moves glucose channels from intracellular storage to the cell surface. Cech described this mechanism in the Journal of Clinical Investigation. The cascade phosphorylates a protein called AS160 that normally tethers the GLUT4 vesicles in place inside the cell. The phosphorylation releases the tether. The vesicles, now free to move, travel along actin filaments that the signaling cascade simultaneously remodels to create a clear path from the cell interior to the membrane surface. When the vesicle reaches the membrane, snare proteins on the vesicle surface dock with matching snare proteins on the cell membrane, the same vesicle fusion machinery cells use for every membrane insertion event. The vesicle membrane merges with the cell membrane. The GLUT4 channels sitting in the vesicle membrane become part of the cell surface. The channels open. Glucose flows in through the newly inserted pores, each GLUT4 channel transporting glucose molecules one at a time from the bloodstream into the cell interior. Thousands of channels deploying simultaneously across the cell surface produce a measurable drop in blood glucose within minutes of the insulin signal reaching the cell. The glucose monitor reading that drops after a meal is showing you GLUT4 channels opening across millions of cells simultaneously, each cell deploying its stored channels in response to the insulin signal. Speed of the drop reflects how many receptors are available to hear the signal and how many GLUT4 channels each cell can mobilize in response. A faster drop means more receptors, stronger signaling, and more channels deployed per minute. A slower drop means fewer receptors, weaker signaling, and fewer channels opening per unit time. The glucose monitor is measuring your receptor status in real time, meal by meal. The blood glucose level drops because the glucose that was circulating in the bloodstream now has a door to enter the cell. Insulin did not process glucose. Insulin did not convert it, break it down, or metabolize it. Insulin opened the door. The glucose entered under its own concentration gradient, flowing from the higher concentration in the blood to the lower concentration inside the cell through the GLUT4 channel the insulin signal deployed. Every step of the glucose's journey from the blood into the cell depends on GLUT4 being present in the membrane. Without the channel, the glucose circulates past the cell surface, unable to cross, accumulating in the bloodstream while the cell inside starves for the fuel floating just outside its wall. An antenna on the roof receiving a broadcast signal. The broadcast is insulin. The antenna is the receptor. The signal travels down the surface receptor cable into the house and tells the household to open the front door. Glucose enters through the open door. Remove the receiving equipment. The broadcast still arrives, but the house cannot hear it. The door stays closed. Glucose remains outside. I experience the signal receiving hardware analogy differently. The evening the receptor physics replaced the phrase processing sugar in my understanding of my own fasting glucose number. The cells were not broken. The doors were not damaged. The glucose channels were sitting in their storage vesicles, fully functional, waiting for a signal that was no longer getting through because the cell had removed the surface receptor that receives it. The machinery was intact. The communication was interrupted. The distinction between broken machinery and interrupted communication is the most practically significant distinction in the insulin physics, because broken machinery requires repair and interrupted communication requires only that the signal environment change. The cell did not need fixing. The cell needed a different pattern of stimulation, and the receptor adjustment would follow the pattern change. Why does the cell remove the receiving equipment? Chronic overstimulation. When any receptor receives its signal too frequently, the cell responds by pulling the receptor off the surface and storing it inside the cell in endosomes. The process is called receptor downregulation, and it operates through clathrin-mediated endocytosis, the same cellular machinery the body uses for every receptor type. Clathrin coat proteins assemble on the cytoplasmic side of the membrane, the coated pit pinches off, and the receptor is pulled into an endosome inside the cell. The insulin receptor feeds through this system whenever the chronic stimulation threshold is exceeded. Fewer receptors on the surface means a weaker response to the same signal concentration. The cell has turned down its sensitivity. Downregulation is proportional to the frequency and magnitude of the stimulation. More frequent insulin spikes produce more receptor removal. Higher insulin peaks produce more receptor removal per spike. The cell reads the pattern of stimulation and adjusts its receptor count to match. If you eat 3 meals with no snacking, you produce 3 insulin spikes per day, with hours of low insulin between them. The receptors have time to recycle back to the surface during the low insulin windows. If you eat 6 times a day with snacking between meals, you produce 6 to 8 insulin spikes with minimal recovery time. The receptors are pulled off faster than they return. The net surface count drops across months and years. Receptor downregulation through chronic insulin stimulation follows this dose-response pattern through measurable changes in receptor surface density. Receptor internalization in response to sustained ligand stimulation is a regulated cellular response. Saltiel and Kahn established this in Nature. Now, the downregulation is a spiral. Fewer surface receptors means a weaker cellular response to the same insulin concentration. The pancreas detects the weakened response through the blood glucose that remains elevated after a meal. The glucose that should have entered the cells through GLUT4 stayed in the bloodstream because the doors did not fully open. The pancreas responds by producing more insulin, louder signal to compensate for the reduced signal receiving hardware count. The louder signal reaches the remaining receptors, and the cell reads the louder signal as further evidence of chronic overstimulation. More receptors are pulled off. The signal must get louder still. The spiral drives itself. Fewer receptors demand more insulin drives further receptor removal, further removal demands still more insulin. The arithmetic is slow. Each year the receptor count drops by a small percentage. Each year the fasting insulin rises by a small amount to compensate. Each year the beta cells work slightly harder. The accumulation is invisible on any single blood test because the glucose stays normal. The compensation succeeding even as the underlying receptor count declines. The spiral runs for years behind a normal glucose reading, detectable only if someone measures the fasting insulin level, which standard screening rarely includes. A fasting insulin of 25 microunits per milliliter, roughly 4 times the optimal level, can maintain a fasting glucose of 92 for years. The glucose looks healthy. The insulin tells a different story. The pancreas is working 4 times harder than it should need to because the receptor count has dropped enough to require 4 times the signal to produce the same glucose clearance. The hidden decade between the onset of receptor downregulation and the first abnormal glucose test is the window where intervention is most effective and least likely to occur, because the metric being monitored does not reveal the problem. Well, the spiral physics explained the 5-year drift in my own fasting glucose. 85 to 110 was the arithmetic of a spiral that had been running for years, each year removing a few more receptors, each removal requiring slightly more insulin to produce the same glucose clearance, each increase in insulin driving slightly more removal. The number on the test was a snapshot of a process that had been accumulating silently behind normal glucose readings for possibly a decade before the compensation failed enough for the fasting number to rise. Receptor downregulated, spiral drove the compensation higher. Glucose began rising when the compensation could no longer keep pace. But the fasting glucose number, the one checked first thing in the morning, carries a specific physics most people have never been told. The morning number is new. Glucose the liver manufactured overnight. Why is the morning number the highest number of the day? Dawn phenomenon. Between approximately 4 and 8 in the morning, the liver increases its glucose production rate. Cortisol rises as part of the circadian awakening response, peaking 30 to 45 minutes after waking. And cortisol stimulates hepatic gluconeogenesis, the liver converting amino acids, lactate, and glycerol into glucose molecules, and releasing them into the bloodstream. The production is necessary. The brain requires glucose overnight. The muscles need a ready supply for the physical demands of waking. And the cortisol surge ensures the liver produces it. The system works perfectly when the insulin signal can regulate the production rate. The liver produces glucose. Insulin says how much is enough. The liver listens and modulates its output accordingly. When your liver insulin receptors are fully functional, insulin suppresses this overnight glucose production. The liver hears the insulin signal, reads it as enough glucose is available, stop manufacturing more, and reduces its output. The fasting glucose stays in the normal range because the liver's production is held in check by the insulin signal it can hear. When your liver insulin receptors have downregulated, the liver cannot hear the suppression signal. The insulin is circulating. The liver's receptors have been internalized through the same downregulation that affected the muscle cells. The liver keeps manufacturing glucose because the signal telling it to stop is not getting through. The glucose it produces adds to whatever residual glucose remains from the previous day's meals. The fasting number rises. Hepatic failure to suppress gluconeogenesis in response to insulin is a primary driver of elevated fasting glucose. Samuel and Schulman documented this in Cell Metabolism. Morning glucose was never about what you ate for dinner. If you eat nothing after 6 in the evening and check your glucose at 7 the next morning, finding it higher than the reading taken at 10 the night before is seeing the liver's overnight production. The glucose went UP while you fasted, because the liver manufactured it and released it into a bloodstream whose insulin signal was too weak to tell the liver to stop. The morning number was about what your liver produced while you slept. Driven by a cortisol signal, the liver followed, and an insulin signal the liver could no longer hear. 110 at 7 in the morning. I had eaten nothing for 12 hours. The glucose was new. The liver manufactured it overnight because its insulin receptors had downregulated along with the muscle receptors, and the cortisol that rises every morning to prepare the body for waking drove the production the insulin could not suppress. The number on the meter was a readout of hepatic gluconeogenesis, not dietary residue, and then the organ compensating for the entire system, the pancreas, has been running at maximum output for years. The physics of what happens when the compensation can no longer sustain itself is the physics of the transition from insulin resistance to type 2 diabetes. What happens to the pancreas after years of overproduction? Beta cells in the islets of Langerhans produce insulin. When the body's receptor count drops and higher insulin levels are needed to maintain glucose clearance, The beta cells increase their protein synthesis rate to produce more insulin per cell. The compensation works. For years, sometimes decades, the fasting glucose stays near normal while the circulating insulin level climbs. The glucose test reads normal. The insulin level, which is rarely tested in routine screening, is elevated. The resistance is hidden behind successful compensation. This is the phase that lasts for years, sometimes a decade or more. The glucose is normal. The physician says the numbers look fine, and the spiraling insulin resistance accumulates silently because the metric being checked, glucose, is still being held in range by a pancreas that is working harder every year to maintain it. The fasting insulin level would reveal the compensation. The fasting insulin is rarely ordered. If your physician has been tracking fasting glucose annually and the numbers have drifted upward by 5 to 10 points across a decade, the glucose is telling you the compensation is beginning to fail. The insulin level, if measured, would reveal how long the compensation has been running and how hard the pancreas has been working to maintain the number the annual test reports as borderline. Compensation has a cost. Beta cells running at maximum protein synthesis capacity for years accumulate stress in the endoplasmic reticulum, the organelle that folds and packages the insulin protein. Proinsulin, the precursor molecule, requires precise disulfide bond formation in the endoplasmic reticulum lumen to fold into functional insulin. Chaperone proteins, particularly BiP, assist each molecule through the folding process. Under chronic overproduction, the chaperones become saturated, misfolded proinsulin accumulates, and the cell activates the unfolded protein response. The cell attempts to reduce the protein synthesis rate and increase the folding capacity of the endoplasmic reticulum. If the stress resolves, the cell recovers. If the demand continues at maximum, the folding machinery cannot keep pace. Misfolded proteins accumulate, and the cell activates its programmed death pathway. The beta cell sacrifices itself rather than releasing defective insulin into the circulation. Beta cells begin dying. Each dead beta cell represents permanently lost production capacity because adult beta cells have limited regenerative ability. The insulin-producing population shrinks. The output that was maintaining glucose control despite the elevated resistance starts to decline. The compensation that sustained normal glucose for a decade fails. The fasting glucose rises above the diagnostic threshold. The diagnosis changes from insulin resistance to type 2 diabetes. Beta cell exhaustion through chronic overproduction and endoplasmic reticulum stress follows this timeline through measurable stages of declining beta cell mass. Beta cell apoptosis from sustained compensatory hyperinsulinemia is a primary mechanism in the transition from resistance to diabetes. Cerf described this in Frontiers in Endocrinology. Transition from resistance to diabetes is a production failure following years of overproduction. The cells that compensated exhausted themselves compensating. The receptor downregulated. The spiral drove the compensation higher. The liver manufactured glucose overnight. The pancreas exhausted itself. Every stage was an adaptation or a consequence of adaptation, and the adaptation is reversible, because the receptors the cell pulled off the surface are stored inside the cell, not destroyed. What reverses the downregulation? 3 inputs, each targeting a different component of the signal pressure that drove the receptors off the surface. Meal spacing. Fewer meals means fewer insulin spikes, means more time at low insulin. Between meals means less receptor internalization pressure. The 3 meals without snacking pattern provides insulin cycling, spike, recovery, spike, recovery, spike, overnight recovery. The recovery windows allow receptors to recycle from endosomes back to the cell surface. Constant grazing eliminates the recovery windows. The arithmetic is specific. After each meal, gastric emptying and the resulting insulin peak take approximately 3 to 4 hours to subside to baseline. A recovery window of 2 to 3 hours at low insulin allows receptor recycling before the next meal drives the next spike. 3 meals with no snacking provides 3 recovery windows per day. 6 eating events provides 0 recovery windows because each spike overlaps with the preceding spike's clearance phase. Walking after meals. Muscle contraction activates a second pathway to GLUT4 translocation that bypasses the insulin receptor entirely. The postprandial walking interception, the 20-minute walk after eating, clears glucose through the exercise pathway without requiring insulin. Blood glucose drops. The pancreas produces less insulin in response. The The signal frequency decreases. The receptor downregulation pressure eases. The exercise pathway does double duty, clearing glucose and reducing the insulin signal that drives the resistance. The first walk after dinner changed the arithmetic. The evening my glucose monitor showed the drop in real time. The bypass key worked. The receptor the cell had removed was irrelevant to the glucose that entered through the exercise lock. The monitor was showing AMPK-mediated GLUT4 translocation, and the number dropped while I watched. The bypass is pharmacologically significant. It means glucose can enter the cell even when the insulin receptor has been fully downregulated, because the exercise pathway uses a completely different signaling cascade that does not depend on the receptor the cell removed. The muscle cell that cannot hear insulin can still absorb glucose if the muscle is contracting. The two keys open the same door through different locks, and the exercise lock still works when the insulin lock is compromised. Walking after each meal is the single most effective non-pharmaceutical intervention for insulin resistance because it simultaneously clears glucose through the bypass pathway and reduces the insulin spike that drives the receptor downregulation. Each walk produces both effects from one behavior. The 20 minutes after eating is the window where the glucose is highest and the walk's impact on blood glucose is greatest. The timing is not arbitrary, it is pharmacokinetically optimal. Eating speed. The glucose peak height, the eating speed discussion described, is upstream of the insulin spike that drives the receptor overstimulation. The same meal eaten faster produces a higher glucose peak, a larger insulin spike, more receptor overstimulation per meal. The same meal eaten over 25 minutes produces a lower peak, a smaller spike, less receptor pressure per meal. Fork speed feeds receptor physics through insulin spike height. A meal producing a glucose peak of 160 milligrams per deciliter triggers approximately twice the insulin release of the same meal producing a peak of 120. Each meal where the fork speed drives the peak higher adds to the cumulative receptor stimulation load the cell responds to by pulling more receptors off the surface. Across 3 meals per day, 365 days per year, the difference between a 20-minute meal and a 6-minute meal compounds into a measurably different receptor stimulation profile across months and years. Now, the membrane fluidity connection. The insulin receptor sits in the cell membrane, and its ability to cluster with other signaling proteins after insulin binding depends on the membrane's fluidity. A membrane rich in unsaturated fatty acids is more fluid, allowing the receptor to move laterally and cluster efficiently for signal transduction. A membrane stiffened by excessive saturated fat or trans fat restricts the receptor's lateral mobility, weakening the signal even when the receptor count is adequate. The membrane composition, determined over months by dietary fat composition, modulates how effectively the remaining receptors function. A membrane that has incorporated more omega-3 fatty acids from fish, flax, or walnuts provides the fluidity the receptor needs to cluster and signal. A membrane that has incorporated more trans fats from processed food stiffens the lipid bilayer and restricts the receptor's movement, weakening the signal even from receptors that are present and functional. The membrane effect operates on a slower timescale than the receptor count effect, weeks to months for the lipid composition to turn over, compared to hours to days for receptor internalization and recycling. Each input reduces the chronic signal pressure or improves the remaining receptor's function. The receptors return to the surface when the signal that drove them off becomes less frequent and less intense. The reversal is not instantaneous. The receptor recycling and membrane remodeling operate on timescales of weeks to months, but the direction is consistent and measurable through fasting glucose and fasting insulin levels that track the receptor resurfacing. Clinical studies consistently show measurable improvements in insulin sensitivity within 2 to 4 weeks of interventions that reduce chronic hyperinsulinemia. The receptor recycling is that fast when the signal pressure drops, the receptors stored in endosomes can return to the cell surface within days of the chronic signal being reduced. The endosome is a storage compartment, not a degradation compartment. The receptors inside it are intact, functional, and ready to reinsert into the membrane when the cellular machinery transports them back to the surface. The recycling pathway runs continuously, and when the internalization rate drops below the recycling rate because the chronic stimulation is eased, the net surface receptor count begins climbing back toward its genetic baseline, and the downstream GLUT4 translocation improves proportionally as the receptor count on the surface increases. Dietary and activity modifications that reduce chronic hyperinsulinemia, produce measurable improvements in insulin sensitivity through receptor resurfacing. Peterson and Schulman confirmed this in physiological reviews. Whether your fasting glucose requires clinical intervention, medication, dietary modification, or monitoring is a determination your physician makes through evaluation of your metabolic profile, your hemoglobin A1C, your fasting insulin, and your individual risk factors. The physics teaches what insulin resistance is at the cellular level. The physician determines what your specific numbers require. If your fasting glucose has risen gradually across 5 to 10 years, you may benefit from asking for a fasting insulin level alongside the fasting glucose. The glucose tells you whether the compensation is still working. The insulin tells you how hard the pancreas is working to maintain it. Both numbers together reveal the stage of the spiral the single glucose test cannot show. Insulin resistance was an adaptation. Every cell adjusts its receptor count based on signal frequency, the same physics across 3 receptor systems. 3 receptor systems, capsaicin, adenosine, insulin, all adjusting through one cellular principle, chronic signal, reduced receptor, weakened response. The adjustment is the cell maintaining its own operating range in an environment that pushed it beyond the range the receptor was calibrated for. The word resistance implies something is broken. The physics shows something is adapting. The adaptation reverses when the environment changes. The cell that received insulin too frequently pulled the receptor off the surface, reduced its sensitivity, and waited for the signaling environment to change. The signaling environment is what you eat, when you eat it, how fast you eat it, and whether your muscles move in the hour that follows. Each variable feeds the signal frequency the cell reads when deciding how many receptors to maintain on its surface. The reversal is giving the cell a reason to put the receptor back. Every input that reduces the signal frequency or lowers the spike height gives the cell a reason to recycle the receptor back to the surface. Every input changes the signal environment the cell reads when deciding how many receptors to maintain. The resistance was the answer to a signal that came too often. The reversal is a signal that comes less often. The cell adapts in both directions. The direction depends on you.